Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. Today's topic, wild photography, capturing magical wildlife moments. Presented by NatHab Expedition Leader, Giulia Ciampini. I'm your host, Rob Mess. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Take it away, Giulia.
Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate everyone coming out today to talk about this amazing subject. Uh, as you will see, I love photography and love nature and wildlife photography, and there's nothing that's more valuable than spending a lunch talking about this subject. So I'll introduce myself before diving into the topic. I am an expedition leader with NatHab. I've been a photography teacher for about 15 years and a photographer for that time. I have guided in about 30 different countries, but with NatHab, I guide most frequently in Churchill. And so I'll do Churchill's polar bear programs, the beluga programs, and the Northern Light programs. And coming before this, I came with a honors Bachelor of Science, a Master's of Science in Education, and a Master's of Art in Documentary Photography. So this is subject matter I really care for. And I am Canadian, and one of the things that I did in my 20s and 30s was do some very, very big road trips across Canada. And these road trips, the whole purpose of them was to photograph wildlife, to document animals that I would find, birds that I would find. And we would go for, say, 3 or 4 weeks at a time in the summer. And every morning we would wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. to get out early to catch wildlife. Because as you probably know, wildlife typically are more active in the early hours of the day and in the late evening. And so we'd get up early and go for a drive, hoping to catch wildlife, whether bears or moose, any mammals, all birds. And one of the largest trips we did was Toronto to Tuktoyaktuk in Yukon. It's 21 days and 19,000 kilometers. And it was just an incredible experience. At that time, I was a biology student, and it was just a wonderful way to see the country and get to know my camera a lot better. And I made all kinds of errors, but it was a great way to learn. And so a few little pictures from these journeys is you can see how often as a photographer you might be curled up in a ball in front of beautiful animals or wild scenes. And I do really believe that the natural world is our greatest source of excitement and the greatest source of visual beauty. It's so much of everything that makes life worth living. And this was a quote by David Attenborough. And so to kind of dive in a little bit more into what I do with NatHab, I'll talk for a moment about polar bears and the joy of photographing polar bears in polar bear season in Churchill. And so if you know NatHab goes to Churchill, and there is a beautiful population of polar bears, about 618 polar bears in the Western Hudson Bay population. And if you look at this map of Canada, right where you see WH, this is Western Hudson Bay, and that big dense pile of dots represents den locations of polar bears. So you can see that it's very densely packed, the denning locations of polar bears where NatHab goes. And what they'll do is they'll do wildlife tours in Wapusk National Park on old military roads in these beautiful vehicles that look like this, these polar rovers. And so you get out onto these old military roads and you are being brought into polar bear habitat. And it's really an incredible expedition. It's one of my favorites to guide. And I'm going to take you through I think one of my first experiences finding polar bears in nature. So you're out early when the sun is rising and you go out onto these old military roads. And one day we parked for a lunch, and it was the summer season, and we weren't anticipating seeing polar bears. We're there for beluga season, but the driver at one point pointed to the water and he said, "Hey, look over there. There looks like there's a polar bear." And I was quite far away. But all of a sudden, we had everyone in the vehicle starting to get really excited because there was a polar bear in the distance. And so there was a hush over the van, and the polar bear came closer. And you're all holding your breath. You're really excited for this moment, and you're hoping that this bear will get curious and will come even closer. And so we're holding our breaths, and the polar bear climbs out onto the rocks from the water, and then progressively comes closer to the vehicle. Very, very curious bear. And he's sniffing the air, and everyone in the vehicle is really excited, and you can feel that excitement in your chest. There's something pretty magical about this experience of being in this environment. And this polar bear stayed with us for quite a bit of time. It sniffed around the rocks and the wood. It came close to the vehicle, and kind of wiggled around a bit, gave us a really, really good show, and no one there was anticipating seeing this. And eventually it came even closer that you can see individual hairs on its neck and the whiskers on its nose, and it stayed with us. And I don't think there's a greater feeling than getting to witness wildlife in their natural habitat, and sitting and staying with them and observing this. So as a photographer, one of the questions I always ask myself is, how do you go from capturing an image of an animal that is just documenting this animal to creating something that is really beautiful, that conveys emotion or captures a sense of time, place, or moment, when you're aiming for that artistry over just the documentation. And so in this presentation, I'm going to give a few ideas. I'll talk a little bit about the technical side of things, but it will just more be a focus on some of the maybe conceptual ideas that you can take with you into your next program or into your next photographic journey. And I will say that wildlife photography and bird photography and nature photography can be very challenging. Some of the common issues that I hear is, I missed focus, my camera was out of focus, or I really have a hard time focusing on the subject. Maybe the picture is unintentionally blurry, or it's really cluttered and busy, or animals are really hard to predict. They're small, they're fast, they move, so it's hard to photograph them. Or you might be newer with your camera and you're confused about what shutter speed you should use, what your aperture should be, or how to use different parts of your camera. So it is a harder craft to master, but I do think that's what makes it so exciting and interesting. So the first thing that I would like to say is that if your expectation is that you go into the field and every single image you take is incredible, I think the expectation is not realistic. I think in reality, when you're out in the field, it's more likely that you will miss shots or not get the shots you're after. You'll get more failures than you will success, but I don't think the success will come without those failures. So I think you need to have lots of room for failure in order to achieve great success. So before we dive into these conceptual ideas, I want to talk about a little bit of the technical side and some ideas to go into the field with. The first thing I made a note of is shooting in RAW versus shooting in JPEG. And these are two different file formats that your cameras will have. The recommendation is absolutely that you would shoot in RAW if you intend to edit your work. RAW is the most beautiful ingredients possible for a picture. And so I think it's a really strong practice to shoot in RAW and learn how to edit and work with your work. Compared to shooting in JPEG, where your camera does a lot of the processing for you, but the processing won't be what you want or how good you'd like it to be. So first recommendation is shoot in RAW. When you're looking for wildlife photography, you can use burst mode, and it's essentially your camera will take more pictures in quick succession. And so there you can get the subtleties of motion or different expressions and gesture in the animal. If your cameras have eye tracking or animal tracking modes, that's definitely a great thing to turn on or look for. Some of your cameras might not have this mode, but some of your cameras might. So diving into a YouTube video or your camera menu and asking, does my camera have this feature, is a really great one to do. Similarly so with your autofocus points, doing something called AF continuous mode. On a Canon, it would be AI servo, and on an Nikon, it's AFC mode. That's a great idea. There, what will happen is your camera will continuously focus on a moving subject, and oftentimes with wildlife, the subject is moving. Utilizing long lenses to allow you to get closer to your subject without physically getting closer to your subject. Some cameras also have a silent mode, and that's a great thing to turn on if your camera does. You could have an electronic shutter, for example, and that will be more silent than your mechanical shutter. And then also upgrading your camera cards is a really great idea, because you can write your picture to your camera more quickly, so you're not waiting for your camera to process each image. It speeds up your camera. So these are just a few technical considerations before I get into the more conceptual thing. If you want to grab a screen grab of this, it's a good idea to have. And if you have any questions about the technical side of things, please feel free to ask. A few more little points. It is a great idea on all your lenses to have a UV filter. That way, if you drop a lens or you hit a lens, it's more likely that the UV filter breaks than the lens itself. This alone has saved me for very expensive lenses. So it's something I always recommend to photographers. And the UV filter is just that clear filter. It will protect your lens from sand, dirt, dust, mud, water, and physical scratches. It may have a slight haze or a bluish tone, but you can remove it to clean it, and I consider it to be essential, absolutely essential. And before we get into the good stuff, I want to bring 3 points for just better wildlife photography off the bat. One thing you can instantly do to improve your photography is have lead room, so space for your subject to go into, and that would be, for example, in this case, this blue-footed booby is right against the frame on the outside. It doesn't have any room to fly into. So if you were to position it so that it has more room in front of the subject and it's not hitting the edge of the frame, immediately your frame is going to be more pleasing to the eye. Immediately looking out for mergers or where different elements of the frame overlap. So in this example of the northern gannet, how its wing tip and its wings are overlapping with the horizon, just being very conscious of where the animal is in relationship to where things it can overlap on is a very strong thing to look out for. And then keeping your sensor and lenses cleaned regularly. You can see this picture here. It is a mess, and there's a lot of dirt and specks. It's shot at f/22, and you can really see all the dirt when you're shooting at that kind of aperture. So those 3 things: clean your lenses, allow for lead room, and watch your mergers. It's a really great thing to keep in mind. Let's see here. So with all photography, I would say your most important things are light, composition, and moment. And this is especially true for wildlife and bird photography. So having these ideas in mind always when you have your camera, light, composition, moment, it will lead to more beautiful images. And we'll dive right in now to the conceptual ideas, starting with wildlife portraiture. So when we look at an image of an animal, whether a bird or a mammal, one of the things that we can look to is a particular set of ideas. And I think this diagram really illustrates them. It's made by Melissa Grew, and she's a fantastic bird photographer. And she's recently done a course through Cornell Labs. And Cornell Labs, if you're not familiar, is a wonderful educational site. And they do educational programs on different types of birds and bird photography, bird artistry, all of that. And she made this diagram, and I think it illustrates some of the effective things that you can do with portraits of animals. And so we'll just run through a few of these and then talk about them more deeply. So one of the first things, as I said, is leaving more space in front of your subject than behind gives the feeling that your animal has room to breathe and exist in the frame. Looking for sharp focus on the eye, and shooting from eye level is a great way to form a connection to the animal in question. Shooting with a shallow depth of field such that the bird or the animal is in sharp focus and the background is clear and clean and out of focus draws your attention much more to the bird itself. And looking for even light or interesting light on the subject itself. So really great course from Melissa there, but we'll dive into a few more of these ideas. And so one of the ideas that you can use to draw more attention to your subject is using a shallow depth of field, but then shooting through leaves or through plants or flowers, because your eyes will search for points of sharp focus. And so if you choose the eye of the animal to be the point of sharpest focus, you're guiding your viewer's eye to that point. And then you can intentionally blur other elements in the frame, really giving you almost a delicate beauty in your images. And so if you like, usually a lot of people that come to watch these talks, they're fantastic photographers already. And this idea of a shallow depth of field isn't a new idea, but it's a really great technique to use with wildlife photography. So essentially, if you are newer, a shallow depth of field means just a small plane of your, a small portion of your focus, a small portion of your image will be in sharp focus where the rest will be blurry, and you can define how much or how little of that plane is in focus. So here we see that it's just that plane where the elk has its face on, but before or after the elk, it's in a soft blur. So we do this by shooting with a small f-stop. So the smaller your f number, the smaller will be in focus, the smaller amount will be in focus. But also the longer your lens, the longer the focal length of your lens, the less will be in focus. And also the greater the distance between your subject and the background will really exaggerate this shallow depth of field. So as we're shooting wildlife, getting really low to the ground, I'll talk about this more in a moment, but getting low to the ground will help your compositions so much. If you're in a situation like this, for example, where you have this fox in a field of grass and your camera is really struggling to focus on the fox's eye, one thing you can do is switch to manual focus and then yourself proceed to focus so it's sharply on the eye and not catching focus on a blade of grass or anything in front of the animal itself. And one of the things about catching the eye in focus, one of the things you can do is wait for a moment where the wildlife, you see this catch light in their eyes. So essentially the light from the sun or the light from the area around the animal is reflecting off their eye and giving this little gleam of reflection. And that alone will make the animal appear more animated and lively than if it was just a dark eye without that catch light, without that light. So on the subject of getting the eye in sharp focus, you will have a bunch of autofocus points in your camera, and then being able to manually manipulate where that autofocus point lands, and then choosing to land that autofocus point on the eye itself will ensure that the eye is sharpest in focus. And when you have a sharply focused eye, your sense of connection to the animal itself is so enhanced. We feel much more intimacy and connection, and getting to the actual level of the bird or animal transports us into that perspective. Also, if we're smaller in our approach, we're less likely to scare an animal away, giving us a little bit more time to work and photograph with an animal. So this is a gorgeous picture. This was the Audubon's 2021 winner, and it's an Anna's hummingbird. And the winning photographer here, one of the thing that I think they did so beautifully well is the eye is so sharply in focus, but everything else in the frame is not. And this goes to really illustrate the point that if the eye is sharp, the image will be more pleasing. Nothing else has to be sharp in this frame, but the eye of the bird itself, feeding in these flowers, made for a really spectacular image. And one little note about bird photography is birds are strange when caught head-on. They don't look quite as majestic from head-on. Oftentimes the profile of a bird is a much more pleasing image just based on the shape. You can see the different beak shapes and the different curves of the neck, curves of the body in a very different way. So of the two images, maybe besides the beautiful blowing of the feather in the leftmost image, definitely catching a bird in profile will elevate a bird's image. So another thing that we can do in field with our portraits is search for areas of contrast. So we know that it is to an animal's advantage to be camouflaged in their environment. They're less likely to be found by predators if they can camouflage into their environment. But this will lead to maybe a less strong picture. So we look for, as photographers, we look for ways we can contrast our animal to their environment. So that might be using size as a contrast, using color as a contrast, or this example here as light. So waiting for the light to change so that we can highlight the wildlife against a darker background, helping us really accentuate the subject and make it stand out from its environment. It's a very different feel of the image, just using light as a source of contrast. So my friend here, Lisa, she's demonstrating a fantastic position for wildlife photographers. It is an incredible perspective to get low on animals. Here she's doing a video, and she's got a little mini tripod to help her get stabilized and low. But it's leading to this perspective where this is a shot that I had in Galapagos, where we are there with the animal. We are, right there. We can see them sleeping on the ground. We, as viewers in these images, we feel this image differently because the photographer has transported us to where the animal is. You're right on that same level with them. You understand where they are in their environment. And this beautiful illustration of another point that is quite important by this photographer, Libor. What they are demonstrating here is where you are positioned in relationship to your subject can have profound effects on the background behind your subject. So moving down, you might see more sky and get a different color than you would if you moved to the left or the right or back or front. So moving around your image to change the background, change the relationship, can lead to very drastically different images. And so anytime I have the privilege to photograph an animal, I will try to work that shot from as many angles as I can to get different feel from the animal to the environment. I might get closer if I have the time, or the animal doesn't feel scared. I might get further away, position myself lower or higher, really move around the frame to get to work that shot. What I see quite often with newer photographers is they'll come to a frame, they'll get one or two images really quickly, and then they'll move on to the next thing. But if you ever have the opportunity to work with an animal, taking it slow and taking the time that you get will always lead to a better image. So we'll jump into now the idea of the environmental portrait. So moving from the portrait itself to now the environmental portrait. An environmental portrait is one where we capture so much more of the scene around the animal. So this isn't an image, obviously. We're filling the frame with this animal. It's so close that we can see the ear tags and the ears, and a little bit of the snow on the nose, and it makes for a very impactful image. However, it's not the only composition that we can get when we do wildlife. And I know there's often this sense that it's a better picture if it's closer, but I would also, and many other photographers would also argue that having more of the environmental context can give you a deeper sense of place and a deeper connection with your subject to the environment around them. So this is an image I really love from Churchill, and it's just a summer polar bear sleeping soundly on the rocks of the Hudson Bay, and getting a sense of the bear in their natural environment in the summer. We kind of expand our vision of them and understand who they are in the relationship to their environment. And this is an image that I took recently in Glacier Bay National Park in Alaska, and I took it by cruise ship, and we were rounding the corner, and unfortunately I had a moment where I had a camera card failure, and unfortunately that does happen on occasion, and we just had this grizzly bear in sight, and it was just this beautiful reflection of this grizzly with symmetrical rocks and a really nice perspective. And my camera card failed, and so I had to quickly change my camera card, and I ran back to the back of the boat, and I thought I missed the shot, and just that instinct to stay with it for just an extra few seconds. And just as we rounded the corner and the bear was no longer in frame and I thought I missed the shot, it peeked its little head over the corner, and you see like the lines of the rock leading to the bear, and it's a very different image than the one that I had in mind, but having a big environmental view I think gives a lot of depth to the image. And a beautiful image by Tim Lehman, a phenomenal bird photographer. One thing that I think he does so well as a photographer is he puts the camera in a perspective that a normal human would never get to see. And so by doing that, he takes us, the viewer, to this perspective, and we get to see the world in a very, very different way. And so here he has a view from above an orangutan, 30 meters up a tree, deep in the forest. And I don't know about you, but this is not a view I've ever seen in my daily life. And so right away, instantly, I'm transformed to just a sense of wonder and amazement, and a place and time. So if you are ever able to set up a camera or to put a camera in a place that other people can't put cameras in, and do so in a way that is very respectful of the wildlife, it will lead to some beautiful images. I will say one of the things that I do as a wildlife photographer is sometimes study the images of award winners and other photographers, and I've seen some incredible placements of cameras inside interesting things. And one such example is they had cameras that they put inside the carcasses of dead animals, and then took from the carcass inside the rib cage of the animals out and photographed vultures as they consumed the animals. So thinking, where can I put this camera to show a different perspective on things, I think is a really great question to ask yourself as a photographer. Okay, so we know a little bit more about portraits and things to strive for with our portraits and our environmental portraits. And now we'll come to the coming even closer to your wildlife, coming such that you're capturing mostly the details of your animal. So a quick example, the peacock here and their iridescent feathers, excuse me, and then coming such that the membrane in the eye that protects that extra eye membrane that protects the eyes, if you see it's half there and half not there, and the feathers, I don't know why I keep saying flowers, excuse me, the feathers are half iridescent because it's caught by light and half not. This feeling of half there and half not is kind of accentuated in this picture. But how can we get even closer and show different patterns in the feathers, with colors, with shape, with form? If you remember from your 9th grade or 10th grade art classes, there was the elements of art, and it was line, it was shape, it was form, its texture, its color, value, and tone. Anytime you can reduce an image to these things or accentuate these things, you're going to get a strong image. And so we come in and we just get the different textures and the colors and the patterns of feathers. And this is something that I do often when I photograph birds, is you'll have this beautiful view of a bird, but then you get in a little bit closer and you notice very intricate details of the feathers and of the fur and of the patterns there. And so as a nature photographer, I think one of the things that keeps you shooting is the different projects that you can have for yourself, and the different ways that you can look at the world in front of you. And so one tiny project that I have is the different feather patterns of birds. And so often it's been predatory birds that I've been interested in, but coming in and seeing the different patterns that I can find. And whatever the bird is, you notice just this incredible collection of feather patterns and shape and color. And my favorite bird of all time is the golden eagle, and I absolutely love the small feathers in the nape of their neck. It's just this gorgeous pattern of orange gold feathers. And so coming into an animal and honing in on what makes this animal special and these details special. So how we come closer, we might use a telephoto lens or a super telephoto lens. We could have an adapter, a lens that we effectively put in between our lens and our camera that magnifies the lens but cuts the light. Or if you're using a phone, you can choose your longest lens that your phone has as an option. I wouldn't recommend pinching and zooming because you're reducing the quality there. But if you choose your longest lens, which might be your 3 or 10 times after you go to your photos and your lenses, that will get you a little bit closer to the animals. Okay, as a next idea, birds in flight, which can be very, very challenging to photograph. And I love this little comic here. of this photographer waiting a whole year trying to get the shot of a bird in flight, but the darn thing wouldn't take off. And then the naturalist coming and saying that it's actually a flightless species and it would never fly. So this brings about the point, the more you know about a species that you're photographing, the more likely you are to take pictures that are wonderful. If you're coming in and you don't know much, it's going to make it challenging. So I was recently on a trip in Galapagos Islands on expedition, and I was noticing the dive bombing behavior of the blue-footed boobies, and I thought it was absolutely incredible behavior, just this extraordinarily fast dive bomb fishing behavior, and I wanted to capture an image that exemplified this. And so I would watch and I would watch, and every single time I caught a single image of it, it didn't show it quite enough. So I ended up deciding to stay as steady as I could and handheld my camera, and then photographed about 7 frames during this dive bomb. And then later in Photoshop, I stitched all those frames together. And in one frame now I have this one single bird diving in to catch fish, and I think it more exemplifies this behavior of this bird. And there was an incredible photographer, I don't recall the name at the moment, but they were noticing the patterns of birds in flight, and they set up I think it was over 1,000 shots of a swarm of birds, and did this idea, but in such a greater quantity. And you saw this very intricate patterns, flight patterns of birds itself. If you're curious, I'll see if I can find the name of it, but it was just incredible to see how photographers can conceptualize behavior in birds or behavior in animals, and how they can think about how to represent those. So when we photograph birds in flight, one of the things that we might consider, or we should be considering, is our shutter speed. A fast shutter speed will freeze motion, where a slower shutter speed will blur motion. And we can use both creatively to our advantage. So capturing, for example, a fast shutter speed of this little storm petrel just landing on the water and capturing this little bit of water rippling. This would be a faster shutter speed. Something like this, blue-footed booby just landing on the water itself and then flying. You see, it's maybe not the fastest shutter speed, because you see it's taken at 1/640th of a second, and you see some blur in the wing itself. But if you're newer to bird photography, a few tips that I have is absolutely practice with common subjects in your area, wherever you are. Find the most common birds to photograph and practice with those common subjects. And look at when and where birds land and take off. Oftentimes when they take off or land, they slow down their flight. And so it's in that moment, in takeoff and in landing, that you're more likely to get an image of them. Also looking out for patterns of how they fly, it will really help you. And so one little rule for photographers is the handheld rule. And so your lens will have a focal length, which is typically measured in millimeters. So you might have a 50 millimeter lens. And your shutter speed, if you want a sharp picture, shouldn't be less than 1 over the focal length of your lens. So if you're shooting with a 50 millimeter lens, your shutter speed wouldn't be less than 1/50th of a second. If you're shooting with 200 millimeter lens, it would be faster than 1/200 of a second. So that's your shutter speed handheld rule. But sometimes you might want slower shutter speeds and more creative effects there. But back to this idea, Different birds also have different wing speeds and different patterns of flight. And so if you can look at the bird you're photographing and kind of assess how fast their wings are beating and gauge how fast your shutter speed needs to be based on that. For example, a great horned owl, it's very fast wing speed versus, say, a great gray owl. And so getting to know the different flight patterns of your particular bird, or if they're acrobatic in any way, when do they do their interesting acrobatics in the air. Watching, for example, the frigate birds coming to fish, and then watching them until you start to see a pattern, and then moving the camera and following through the bird's motion tends to help you get a better shot. And I will say, there's also a lot of creativity that can happen when you slow down your shutter speed. And so we saw the pelicans, these brown pelicans, they also do this dive bombing behavior. And so in this case, I slowed down my shutter speed to 1/25 of a second and moved the camera slightly with them, a very slight panning motion. And with this, you don't get a sharp bird, but you do get a sense of motion with the birds. And so you start to get a little bit more of a creative, artistic, evocative approach to wildlife photography. Or you can pan. This is red-tailed hawk, and so it's flying across the frame, and slowing down your shutter speed and following that motion will ensure that the bird is somewhat sharply in focus, but the background is moving. And so you feel the motion of the bird. And one of the most incredible things about birds is how quickly and powerfully they move through their environments. So how can we capture that? And sorry, this is a little low resolution, but this idea of how can we capture a sense of motion through the frame. And this was another example of that panning. And so with panning, you are so frequently getting bad shots. You may not be perfectly aligned with the speed of the animal that's moving in your frame, or they might not be moving in the right pattern. But when you do get a successful shot, it is much more enjoyable because of the effort that you've put in. So another little point that I have to make is this idea of, okay, so we get beautiful portraits, we get pictures of animals in their environment, but how can we dive a little bit deeper and show behavior and relationships in wildlife? And that's where I absolutely love natural habitat adventure trips and trips where you have a naturalist guide with you, because they have such a knowledge of particular behaviors, and they can really help you sit with the wildlife for longer and understand the behaviors, so that you are then capturing more of that pinnacle behavior and not just an image of the wildlife. And so kind of sitting and seeing that communication, or seeing that interaction, seeing whether feeding, whether mating, whether anything that an animal does in their natural day-to-day life. If you look out, for example, of a colony of animals, which do you focus on? Is there something that's going on beyond just lying? Animals and mammals spend so much of their life just sleeping and lying. And so when do we capture these little glimmers of interaction, or these subtle moments between two animals? And whenever you have an opportunity, look for odd numbers of animals. Look for threes, look for fives. Beyond the couples, beyond the mating pairs, or the two, threes are a really interesting number. The human brain has a harder time resolving threes or odds, so that the image becomes a little bit more interesting when there are threes in there. And I will say, I think one of the best things you can do as a nature and wildlife photographer is increase your naturalist knowledge. And I don't think this image of a merganser is particularly exquisite in any way, but this bird taught me a lot about photography. And I was at Stanley Park in Vancouver, a beautiful place to capture some birds. And uh, this bird does this interesting dive, deep dive, and then it will come up, and you can see a little bit of the water speckled in its hair. But I can never predict when it would dive. I would always catch the end, so I would just get the butt of the bird as it's going into the water. I wouldn't get him kind of coming into the water until I sat there and, you know, put the camera down for a minute and just sat there and watched this bird. And I watched until I got a sense of its behavior. And what it would do is it had a very, 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 very subtle head tilt before it would dive into the water. And so as soon as I saw that head tilt, the next moment it would dive. And after this, I started to get the images that I wanted of this bird. And it wasn't until I put the camera down and spent time watching the bird that this happened. And so coming in and looking for, you know, feeding behaviors and hunting behaviors, and really taking the time, as much time as you can with an animal, sit with them, watch them, wait. You're always going to be led to a more incredible image, as you spend more time with an animal. So it's a little, and for me, I always think there's a lot of magic in the smallest gesture, whether it's preening, whether it's caring for young, whether it's the little things that I think hold so much power in photography. So often on wildlife programs, you're with a group, and there's group photography etiquette. And when I lead groups, there's a few things that I will absolutely emphasize, and one of that is being quiet, taking as little, like being as quiet as possible, whether it's you, your camera, your movements, your voice. That quietness will allow for the animal to be in their environment and to show you more interesting behaviors. Putting your camera in silent mode, moving aside so that someone in your group can get a picture after you've gotten a picture, kind of sharing the space. What I love about the NatHab vehicles is that everyone will have a window if they would like it, so you all will have a line of sight. But then if you're in a Zodiac, for example, on another program, a beluga program, being able to, you know, grab the picture that you really want and then move your body such that someone else can grab the picture. So it's, you know, you're thinking about others in the group. Also things like making sure that you are wearing gear that makes you comfortable, whether it's footwear, clothing, you need bug spray, sun protection, whatever it is, so that you can stay in the field longer. That will really help. Having a pad to sit on so that you can sit more comfortably. Little things like that. And this will lead to you having more time with the animal, and that more time translates into more magical pictures, always, always, no matter what. It also is just a thrilling experience to witness animals do what they do. And so scanning the background, always around your frame, and looking around. I wanted to make a few notes before I end here about ethics of wildlife photography and how crucial it is to go in with this idea that yes, a beautiful image is something that is valuable to get, but never at the expense of the animal. So having the attitude of doing no harm, no feeding, no, you know, being extremely respectful of how animals are feeding, how they're getting to their home, how they're caring for their young, giving them space, looking out for signals if they are stressed in any way, and removing yourself from that, giving them a wide berth, you know, using your camera as a tool to document something beautiful, but in a way that is very respectful of the animal, I think is paramount. And with that, I will end with this idea of light composition and moment being the most important things to consider. And I think in my next NatHab presentation, which will be in in July 20th, I believe, or 22nd, around there, I'd like to hone in on the topic of light itself, because I think light is one of those just really pillars of photography, and I want to break it down, light and travel photography. So I'm going to save a little bit of that for later. But I'd like to end with this idea: is the more we can teach people about wildlife, the more we can help them be touched by it. And the humans will always want to save the things that they love. And so I think if you're out photographing and documenting wildlife in a beautiful way with love, I think you are doing something very, very powerful. And I hope that anytime you are with your camera, you have that feeling that you have time, you can slow down, there isn't rush, and anytime that you can be more careful and intentional, you will enjoy your photography that much more. And now I'll open it up for a Q&A and say thank you very much as well.
All right, thank you so much, Julia. So now, before we start in with the question and answer session, I would like to remind everyone that you can submit your questions via the question field in your control panel. All right, let's get to some of these questions. So one of our guests notes that they keep seeing the Canon RF 200-500 millimeter listed on your shots. It's not something this guest is familiar with. Can you tell us what this is? Do you have an advanced copy from Canon? We're super curious.
Oh, it should be a 100 to 500. I hope I didn't say 200 to 500. Let me just check. Unless it is 200 to 500. So it is an RF lens. It's one of Canon's mirrorless lenses. Pretty sure it's 200 to 500. I have it in my bag. Can I just check very quickly? Just to see if I made a mistake? One
Sure,
second.
why not?
Yes.
Let's get our facts straight. And again, I'd like to remind everyone, if you do have questions, feel free to submit them via the question field in your control panel. All right, now we're getting to an answer.
Yes, my mistake, my apologies. It is a 100 to 500, not a 200 to 500. 100 to 500. Good eye for that photographer who noticed that. It is not a new RF lens. It is the 100 to 500. And this is an absolute favorite lens of mine. I'll often shoot with an adapter, a 1.4 times adapter, and it's a beautiful, beautiful lens.
Great, good to know we can put our jealousy away. Great. So, what is the minimum speed that you use on your camera cards?
Ooh, so I have camera cards that are quite old, and I'll still use those. But I do notice that I think it's the SanDisk. They have the gold and platinum. Whatever speed those are, I do find those much, much more conducive to wildlife photography. Ooh, excuse me, I won't share my screen here. I find those much more conducive to wildlife photography. So I think that's 1166 times speed. But it's though, yeah,
So, Julia, you just changed off. We're not seeing your presentation
yes.
any longer.
Let me just see if I can whittle it back here. Excuse me.
Not to worry.
Okay. If you did that bring it back?
Oh, we're not seeing it at the moment, but let's just move on with some questions and not be too
Sure.
concerned with it. So, what is the best practice if you don't have a silent mode on your camera?
Um, you don't have a silent mode. That's okay. A little bit of a shutter sound is fine. Um, just move quietly, be quiet in the way that you interact, and that is what it is. A lot of cameras don't have the silent mode, but a lot of cameras will. So if you do have it, I would engage it.
Great, thank you. So one of our guests says they have the 100 to 500 or a R6 MK2, uh, and they're having some difficulty grabbing birds in flight at a distance in focus. Do you have any
Okay.
thoughts on how we could work with that?
I'd have to know a little bit more. Uh, I can leave an email and maybe we can have an exchange to talk about tips there. But like it sounds like you have the right camera, the right lenses, and it's a few settings that you might want to play with. One thing I found with birds and bird photography is back button focus also is very, very helpful. So there are a few YouTube videos that help enable that. And if you take the time to work through getting back button focus, you're more likely to get sharp images of birds.
Great, thank you so much. Um, so unless we do have any other questions, I think that is going to be it for today. So I'd like to throw it back to you for any closing comments you may have.
I just want to thank you all for coming and sharing this lunchtime with me. It is a joy. I'm always sad because I don't get to see your images, but I hope you have a wonderful time in the field, and I can't wait till the next time I get to do this. I think light and photography will be my next subject. But thank you, enjoy your photography, and see you next time.
Julia, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to present for us today. And I'd also like to thank everyone who tuned in today. Now, if you are interested in information on how you can travel with NatHab, go ahead and send us an email at info@nathab.com. Our adventure specialists are happy to help you out. Join us Monday for our next Daily Dose of Nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation, and we will have the replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude today's webinar. Goodbye, everybody. We'll see you next time.